I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you all for listening. Thank you especially to those of you who have taken a moment sometime this week, and I mean actually taken a moment, and I mean this week, just to mention to somebody you know that SLEERICKETS is a podcast that exists, and is a pretty good one, is maybe even above average. I am grateful for your help. That is truly the way people learn about this show, and I appreciate it every time you do it. Thanks also to all of the subscribers to The Secret Show. If you don't yet subscribe to The Secret Show, go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and see what's up. You can put your email address in, and I will give you a week's access for free. There are 40 episodes up now and more coming all the time. I did want to say I got a lot of really lovely notes about the most recent episode on there. It's called Paging Dr. Platsmouth. It was one I was very unsure about releasing. I'm glad I did, I suppose, because of people's response. But I just wanted to thank everyone again for your kind notes. It seemed to mean a lot to some people, and there was a conversation that meant a lot to me. So there's that. If you are curious, then again, go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and see what you think. There are a few different ways to subscribe. It is pretty cheap. Although if you are rich, there's a rich person option just for you. Rich or generous, just exceedingly saintly, as some of the motherfuckers of the arts, as I call them, are true modern day saints. And if money is a problem for you, then say, write me a fucking note, sleerickets@gmail.com, and I will respond to you as human beings do. All right, so there are a few things I wanted to talk about today. Let me see if I can try not to forget all of them all at once, as I seem to every time I fucking do this. So first, I have a bunch of really great emails from people. I'm going to just record a Secret Show episode where I respond to all of those coming up. So if you wrote me a note, I try to at least send a line or so back to everybody, but there's an episode coming with proper responses to all that on the Secret Show. Also, just a seed to plant, something to think about. I don't want to blow up the spot too much, but in the, not distant future, I mean, somewhat distant future, in the indeterminate future, it looks like most of the SLEERICKETS team will be in New York all together at the same time and able to breathe one another's COVID-infected air, even possibly in the same room. So we don't really have any plans other than just to be people together. But I don't know. Like, maybe I'm just thinking about like what we could do. This will be Alice, Brian, and me. And, if we can find Cameron a flying horse or a private jet, any of you ultra rich listeners who feel like donating a PJ for the cause, I suppose he could fly on a regular plane as well. But at any rate, that may not be possible, but we're just, we may try to do something. And I don't totally know what that would be other than just hang out, but maybe it would be something. If you have thoughts or suggestions, or if you live in New York and you want to file a restraining order to make sure that I can't come within 600 yards of your lovely city, then this would be the time to get on that. I did want to mention also, I talked a little bit about the Newburyport Literary Festival on the last episode with Cameron. I do, by the way, have follow-up portions of that conversation with Cameron and another big portion of a conversation with Elijah, both slated to come out on the Secret Show feed. But I talked a little bit about my experience at the festival. It was great. Again, Zara could not have been a bigger help to all of the poets there. Just a delightful person all around. I did want to mention also that I heard Alfred Nickel read. Fuck, I already fucked up his name again. God damn it. Zara, I need you on hand to tell me when I mispronounce words at all times, Zara. Alfred Nicole, as his name is apparently pronounced, read from a really weird book of World War I trench haiku, which he translated. There was 100 haiku from in French that he translated into English. And honestly, like, this just sounds like a terrible idea for a book to me, just to my naked, unprepared ears. It sounds like a terrible idea. But he read from it, and it was kind of staggering. So I bought a copy off him in his car. he gave me a ride, and I held him up for a copy of his book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But it was another sort of weird standout of that whole experience. Anyway, I did also, though, there was something the first night of the festival. My brother and I got there late. We got there smack in the middle of the first reading, and the ushers helpfully led us down to the very front row of the theater, where Andre Dubus and Peter Orner were having a casual conversation on stage. We really made sure to block the views of lots of kind patrons in the second row as we stumbled our way down to truly like center of the first row, where we were seated midway through the presentation. But there were a couple things that stuck with me from that first little talk. One was just that Peter Orner, I mean, both of these guys were both sort of scraggly, handsome, 50-ish white guys who wear sort of like stylishly working class inflected clothes, and are just like very charming and effortlessly. They, like, both of these guys could definitely be cast as the attractive, mischievous English professor who effortlessly seduces the ingenue in the opening episode of the 6th season of a beloved teen drama, say, just for instance. But Peter Orner in particular had this quality on stage. I mentioned that there were a lot of different reading styles. He had this quality on stage I'm so envious of. So I think for one, like, it was a proper, I don't know if it didn't have an extended proscenium on the stage, but it was like a proper theater, like community theater. Like a community theater in like a nice town with like a good budget. Really like lovely theater. But so like it had better acoustics than some other spaces might, and he did have a microphone, though he seemed like barely even to be picked. He sort of held it upside down like gangster style, sort of, and like he seemed like he was all barely even getting picked up by it. But he just sort of talked at like normal conversational level, seemed not to have prepared a lick, and spoke with seemingly no extra like adrenaline or oomph of anxiety or nervousness. I mean, when I'm giving any kind of presentation on stage, I've spent a lot of time on stage, and I still get really worked up. I even got a note after the reading saying like, "Hey, you seemed a little frenetic up there. Were you okay?" After my reading, in a much smaller space. But I'm so envious of this quality that Orner had. He just seemed to be not trying at all, and yet he was utterly captivating. Just really had the whole audience in the palm of his hand. But he said a couple things about writing and experience, one of which I wholeheartedly agreed with, and one of which I found I was unconvinced of. So the first thing he said, he was talking about his own experience writing and what it's like to write about yourself, because I think he's written some memoir as well as some fiction. I think he's written fiction. I think I'm correct about that. He read some stories, and I thought they were stories, and it turned out some of them were not stories. So I don't know. I'm obviously really prepared to talk about him, but it was the thing he said that stuck with me, not his biography. He said, "What right do I have to talk about the experience of some working class Jewish kid growing up in Chicago? What business do I have doing this?" And of course he was a working class Jewish kid growing up in Chicago. So I took his point to be that, even if you can identify in pretty narrow terms the category of the character you are writing about, or in whose voice you are writing, it is still, even if you are even if you're so prepared to write in that identity that you are that identity, there's still no such thing as sort of a universal qualification. I very frequently feel uncertain as to, how to write about people who are very much in my same niche of identities. And he went on to say, that the thing is that you've got to just do it right. And this is very much in keeping with, there was a good opinion piece by Caitlin Greenidge. I think I've mentioned on the show before. I'll put a link to it again in the New York Times a few years ago, where she said, the title of the piece, I think, was Who Gets to Write About What? And her conclusion was, when it comes to cultural appropriation, when it comes to own voices and underrepresented groups, there's one set of questions which are publishing questions, like, well, who should we be publishing? But then from a writerly perspective, what you as a writer can do is you say, well, I'm just going to try to write about this right. I'm going to try to do it right. I'm going to try to do it honestly. I'm going to try to truly consider the perspective of the people whose perspectives I might not have considered before. In her own case, she was talking about writing about an old, rich white lady and how she kind of had to go through a journey to get her bearings in that voice. And her conclusion was, you get to write about it if you do it right. And and generally speaking, I agree with that. And Orner said something very similar, but he went a little further. He said, if you do it right, then people aren't going to yell at you. You're not going to get in trouble if you do it right. And that, I don't know. It's not that I think that's wrong, or it's not that I think everybody gets yelled at, I just think, I don't know that that's true. I don't know that doing writing right really has anything to do with getting yelled at or getting in trouble. They just seem like two separate concerns. This all came back to me this past week because I've been reading submissions for the magazine with which I am affiliated, sometimes to their chagrin, and I had a nauseating thought. It's a thought I've had before, but it never with quite this shading. So the thought was, I wonder if some of these submissions were written by AI. Right? Like we know it's couldn't be more publicized that there are chat programs producing highly convincing writing of all different genres, and we've had plenty of conversations on the show about the quality or the limitations of that technology. But definitely I've gotten submissions where I thought either this is the writing of someone who has only a rudimentary grasp of English, or is using a translation tool in order to render this, or is writing in such a wildly experimental style as to be sort of breaking any functionality in the language, or this is the work of a very low-level AI program, right? I've had that thought before. And of course, what made this a less nauseating thought at the time was that I was not going to accept this work anyway, right? Like I never was tempted. This is not work I was ever tempted to accept. And so, I read it. I thought, this is quite bad. I wonder why someone would write this way. Maybe it's AI. But never along the line did I think, this is something I think we should publish, right? It was always sort of an easy dismissal. So I have since, though, and I've mentioned this to Cameron, that when I read, slush submissions, it is very, very rare for me to read a poem and say, this is just my kind of poem. Like, this is the kind of, I don't have such narrow taste, but it's rare for me to read a poem and say, I find this moving, I find it beautiful, it is language that I connect to. It's a voice that I can hear. It has the qualities I personally strive for in poetry. It's quite rare for me to have that experience. It is slightly less rare for me to read a poem and say, this has got something. This reminds me in various ways of the kinds of poems that other smart people I know like, even though I don't like them. right? I read a poem and I think like, oh, Cameron might like this, or like Shane might like this, or Ryan might like this. You know, and those poems I read and I think, or Armin Davutian, also often I mean, he's our proper poetry editor. I'm just sort of read around the edges and read slush stuff initially, but you know, he has a more enterprising taste in poetry. I'm also actually I need to write him a fucking note. I need to get I've been meaning to get Armin on the show, and we've talked about it some. By the way, if I have talked to you about coming on the show and then we had some exchange and have fallen off, it's not because it's not because I've soured on you, and it's not because I've had some masterful timing in play. I'm just trying to catch up with everything. So if I have let things lapse, just write back to me and remind me, and let's set it up. Okay. I've just got a lot to keep up with. But you know, I often read poems and I think, this is not nothing. This is not mere amateurishness. This is not. It's not that I see what this person is going for and he fails. It's that I don't quite know what this person's going for, but he succeeds at something. He's produced language that is at least interesting, that I can't totally predict, that maybe has some shards of the qualities I look for in poetry. It's not poetry I would try to write. It's not poetry I envy. Maybe that's really it. It's very seldom that I read a poem that I envy. This happened once or twice, really. I mean, very seldom that I truly envy. And those are wonderful occasions. But more often, it's something like this. I say, yeah, okay, you've, like, as Ryan's way of putting this, if I fucked up my microphone, Ryan's way of talking, he says, Ryan will say, oh, he's got game. Right, using basketball slang, meaning like he knows his way around a ball, around a court, around a hoop. He knows he can do things with language that most people can't do, and he seems to be doing them on purpose. And when I read a poem like that, I say, it's not for me. But that doesn't mean I should reject it, because it doesn't mean it's not for everyone. So really, most of the poems I recommend on to those further up the chain, to Armin and Ryan, most of the poems I send along to them are poems that are not really my cup of tea, but that I see as being, I recognize some spark in them. Now, I think at least for the time being, based on what I have read, it would be harder to fool me with a poem that is my cup of tea than it would be to fool me with a poem that is experimental, avant-garde, you know, of a kind of poetry that I'm not really into, but that I recognize as being of value to plenty of smart people, right? A ChatGPT could much more easily fool me, I think, with a language poetry inspired poem than with a Georgian poetry inspired poem, if that makes any sense. Not that those are equal and opposite, or nor that are they comprehensive. Which is, I had that thought, like, eventually, if I keep doing this, surely, if it has not already happened, like, somebody is going to fool me with one of these things. And that made me feel queasy. And I don't know that there's really a solution to that. I mean, it certainly is an embarrassing thought to have. And I think, you know, at some point I should have someone on who is the... Actually, maybe this is something to ask Shane about. Because both he and Joshua Megan, who I'd love to get back on again, like, they are both the sole poetry editor of a magazine. In Shane's case, Image. In Josh's case, Root Quarterly. I'm a lowly sub editor, but I wonder how they think about the goal of choosing poetry for a magazine like that. Because I know some editors think of it in kind of complicated terms. It's not as simple as only publish the very best poetry you can find. It may be that you publish poetry to encourage people. It may be that you publish poetry because it's interesting, if not really all the way finished. Maybe you publish poetry in some cases to curry favor in order to get to publish other poetry. I don't know. I think there are a lot of different possible concerns, but maybe I'm just calling my shot ahead of time to say at some point I'm sure I will be embarrassed by some sort of version of this hoax. But it also, I think, helped me understand a little bit better how I had been thinking about a particular poem. So this poem is called The Grapes. I've mentioned it on here before. It's by Anthony Hecht. It appears in the Venetian Vespers, of which I have a gorgeous signed copy given to me on some fancy occasion by Ryan. The Grapes is a dramatic monologue. It's longish, so I'm only going to read it through once, and I will probably wait before I do that. It's a little longish. It's 2 pages, maybe 3 pages. It's spoken in the voice of a hotel maid at a fancy Swiss hotel. I think it's Swiss. It should be, because I think the names in it are French, and they seem to be in the Swiss Alps. It's first poem in the book. Here we go. Yeah, I believe this has got to be Swiss. So she describes what it's like to work in the Hôtel de l'Univers et Déjeuner, the hotel of the universe and lunch, if memory serves. What it's like to work there. Right across the way, there's a different hotel that's maybe a little bit fancier. It's a little, that they can sort of look to with a little bit of envy. She also looks to her guests with some envy. She has a particular crush on a bellhop whose name is Marc-Antoine, though he may not return her affection. And she spends some time reading the magazines, the old dated magazines, very out of date. Even I think this book came out in the 70s. Is that right? 80s? When did this book come out? Yeah, 79. This book came out in 1979. And these magazines downstairs in the lobby are from the 50s. So she spent some time flipping through those, all the glamorous, movie stars in those old magazines. And then the, titular Grapes, there's a kind of a central moment in the poem when she's watching the sun come down through the clear mountain air, and it illuminates this bunch of grapes, and she has a kind of a recognition that all of her dreams, all of her fantasies about what life might be are just that. And as she puts it, her life has crested. That there's not going to be any more or better from here. It is only going to maybe gradually, or perhaps not so gradually, decline. Things are going to get worse, not better. That's kind of the central. It's very much an epiphany poem, and there are people have a lot of objections to this poem. People often say that it is a. There tend to be a couple of objections, but I think I have notes from 2 smart listeners and more than listeners, friends, who object to it in maybe complementary ways. So I think they probably would also agree with each other, at least somewhat. I'm going to quickly answer this note from Shane. Okay, so here's Zara's note on the Grapes, and then I will read Jonathan's. She had a long, lovely email, but she this is from a little while ago. She closed by saying, "I can't leave without a despairing note decrying Anthony Hecht's The Grapes. The man who stares out at me from the cover of my Borzoi edition of his Selected has no right to take the voice of the chambermaid and empty it in this way of fire and voice and nuance. I much prefer Marilyn Nelson's ballad, a wonderful piece. I'm sure you will tell me I am missing the point of the Grapes." And the ballad in question, I believe, is the Ballad of Aunt Geneva that Brian Bridger and I discussed in that episode. Geneva was a wild one. Geneva was a tart, I think, about the woman and the blue-eyed boy. This is certainly a criticism of the Grapes I've heard before, that Anthony Hecht is sort of slumming and pretending to talk in the voice of this. He is taking on the voice of somebody who's far less educated, who's far less prestigious, holds a far less prestigious social role, may have a very different ethnic or national background from his own, And he's presuming to place this lyric revelation in her mouth. I heard objections like this in grad school when I was first introduced to the poem by Mary Jo Salter. Really great class on, what was it? It was Hecht, Berryman, and Lowell, I think was the class. Great class. Definitely still treasure all the books I got for that class. Then here is, Jonathan said, after listening to the second Bridger episode, I went back and reread The Grapes, and the last line still irks me. So the last line is a reference to an article that she talks about reading in Time, which is an old issue of Time magazine. In it, there's a story of a shipwreck and some survivors on a lifeboat floating out in the ocean. And she refers to that in the last line of the poem and makes a pun on the name of the magazine, Time. So he says, the last line still irks me. I think this might be part of it. The ending seems to resolve the poem by a kind of sleight of hand. Without apparently shifting into a different voice, it makes a concluding pun that seems to belong to the poet rather than the speaker. It's as if he's pushing aside someone the whole poem has been convincing me to care about. Which I think, this is different than Zara's complaint, but maybe it's related. That Hecht, in addition to whatever his social or personal markers as an identity, he's somebody who is deeply concerned with language, who's very skilled with language, probably more so than the chambermaid. He's somebody who cares about rhyme and pun and meter and sound and allusion, and he uses these tools really expertly in a poem that is ostensibly a monologue in this woman's voice. And so I think Jonathan's complaint that he is basically using this woman as an occasion for more of his own dazzling artifice with the language just seems distasteful. It seems, it seems, and I think Jonathan's argument is even more technical. It's not even that he's not even bothering to say that Hecht has no right to do this. He basically says that Hecht sort of defeats his own purpose by drawing us in with an appeal to sort of an authentic experience and then sending us out with a parlor trick. Right, a typical poetic trope, a gimmick, and I think these are really thoughtful objections. Like I think these make plenty of sense to me as objections to the poem, but in an odd way, as I reread the poem and I thought about the vocational doomsday being efficiently delivered to us by AI, I realized that some of what they're talking about, some of the problems with this poem are in fact exactly what draws me to it. I don't want to tell tales out of school, but I've corresponded a little bit with one listener in particular about autism tests. These sort of tests you can take online to gauge how autism is a spectrum, and I think online quizzes are always to be taken with a grain of salt, but I think there are some that seem to be at least informative indications of questions of degree, to what degree you might exhibit some tendencies of autism. And one of these tests was a test for how it was sort of secondary to it was not the primary autism test, but it was a test of how well you fake it, basically. Right? How well you observe others' expressions of emotion, others' modes of communication, and mimic them in yourself. Right? Now, there's a really important distinction in psychology between psychopathy and autism. Right? At least, high functioning, verbally dexterous autism, what we, called Asperger's syndrome for a while, and then stopped calling for some reason. Sometimes these can be confused with one another, right? Because a psychopath also observes normal people and mimics them, but there's a huge difference. The difference is that when an autistic child's mother cries because she's burned her hand, he might not realize what that facial expression means. The psychopath sees that facial expression, and he does know what it means, but he doesn't care. So I think sometimes autistic children and adults are perceived as not caring about others because they're not good at reading others. Psychopaths, in fact, are seldom accused of not caring about others, at least not while they're out and operating successfully in the world, because they're much better at faking it. So I bring up all this because I think it's related to some of what I see happening in The Grapes. Peter Orner says, if you do it right, if you convey the experience of someone who had a different perspective than your own, if you do it right, then people won't be able to tell it was you writing it. Right? This is one of the frequent complaints about works of cultural appropriation. There was a mode of comedy I remember encountering in sitcoms like 10, 15 years ago. And it's often a very funny line. There was a bit in The Office when the tall, very thin, awkward character played by Zach Woods discovered that his ex-girlfriend had been sleeping with another coworker. And had been having a good time. And his objection was, he said, no. Erin hates sex. She says it feels like being tackled by a skeleton. And this is a funny line. Of course, what's funny about it is that he is telling us more about himself than he is about her. Right? That she hated sex with him because it felt like being tackled by a skeleton when she had sex with him. Right? But he has failed to digest this information, and he has projected his own very limited perspective out onto the world. He thinks this is a fact about her, when in fact it's a fact about him. And I think it's something similar to this that we often object to when we call out moments of cultural appropriation, when we call out moments in which a writer has revealed his own prejudices in the depiction of a character who doesn't share his background. There's a little bit brief moment I had, a little twinge of objection I had as a fake Irish. I mean, let me put it this way. I'm not fake Irish in the sense that I don't actually have Irish heritage. I'm fake Irish in the sense that I grew up in America and my family's lived in America for a long time. But, as a proud fake Irishman, I had a little twinge of objection. I had a little twinge when I read in the excellent novel, extraordinarily good novel, The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. A little brief moment when he refers to JFK, John F. Kennedy, first Irish Catholic president of the United States, he refers to him as a wasp. He says that waspy face of his. Now, I totally get why somebody would do that, right? JFK was from an aristocratic, powerful Massachusetts family, right? His father was a bootlegger, I think, and a kingmaker, was Joe Kennedy, extremely powerful and influential man, right? So JFK was royalty. And wasps, particularly in Massachusetts, are sort of, old line white American royalty. And so it makes perfect sense, I think, that someone who's not paying close attention would refer to JFK as a wasp. The problem, and the thing that I so objected to, is that although he is white, he is not an Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? Which is what WASP stands for, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He's not Protestant at all, and he's not Anglo, or he's at least probably, partly Anglo, but he's Celtic, he's Gaelic, he's Irish, right? The WASPs were their sworn enemies. And, of course, in America, there's not really much meaningful difference between, an old, rich Irish family and an old, rich WASPs family. There's not really any meaningful difference. And so, though I had a little inner cringe when I read that, I can't really object to it. But it's this sort of thing that we often find galling when we read a work and we say, this person didn't get it right. He didn't get the experience he's writing about right, because he missed this detail, this perspective, this moment of reflection, this bit of diction that somebody who had lived inside this experience would know. Now, first, as Peter Orner said, there's no such thing as being sufficiently qualified to write about an identity, even being a member of that identity. You're never sufficiently qualified to write about it. But I was reminded of something Stephen Marsh said. Actually, it came up in an article that Carmine and I talked about. He had observed that if you ask ChatGPT to write in a certain famous author's voice, the program will never commit an anachronism. It will never use a word that was not in use at that time. Right? And the better it gets, I'm assuming it also is not going to make other sorts of missteps. Now, ChatGPT is currently, as it currently exists, is full of errors, riddled with errors. Paul Guest says in his wonderful poem Melancholia. The program has lots of bugs and problems, and will continue to have those. But that ability to be categorically perfect when it comes to certain kinds of mistakes, that's an ability that I think really properly belongs only to machines. And I wonder a little bit about placing too much importance on it. Because part of what I see when I read The Grapes is, yes, Anthony Hecht, who is by no means a Swiss chambermaid, putting on the voice of a Swiss chambermaid. I recognize that this woman that he's imagining, or maybe met at some point during one of his own visits to a Swiss resort, this woman would not talk the way he's talking. Certainly would not use the language play that he uses. But I think what I also see in this poem is Hecht working as hard as he can to understand another person, to find his way into another person's voice, and even to do a thing that I think we have, there is a kind of empathy that we've talked a lot about empathy on the show recently, but there's a kind of empathy that I think is, at the moment, is out of favor, which is the empathy of imagining yourself in someone else's shoes. I think one of the, worthwhile criticisms of this form of empathy that has come up in recent years is the observation that we can't entirely imagine being another person. And so if you imagine yourself in someone else's shoes, part of what you have to do is not imagine yourself anymore. And that, of course, is impossible. If you imagine yourself into someone else's shoes, you're always going to be putting on a kind of a disguise, right? You'll always be growly old Anthony Hecht with his goatee putting on the chambermaid's costume. It'll always be it won't quite fit. But that act, that attempt, is something, I find myself performing constantly, and not just in artistic contexts, but in everyday social contexts, because it is often really difficult to understand people. And in order to do my best, I have to place myself in their shoes, which I can only do artificially. I can only do in a flawed way, which I will never get perfectly right, but which is, I think, maybe one of the essential virtues of literature, right? Is not to read a piece of writing that is so perfectly crowdsourced as to contain no anachronisms, to contain no misattributions of speech, to be perfectly characteristic, right? ChatGPT predicts what is the most likely word to come next. It is not going to accidentally insert a word that would never come next, right? There are certain kinds of mistakes it is going to be less and less and less likely to make that humans will continue to make. But the other thing I think we will not see, at least for a long time, from AI, is the attempt of a human being to understand another. Now, the criticisms that Zara and Jonathan leveled hold, right? Just like the criticisms of Ezra Pound's poems, written in the voice of Chinese poets that he, purported to translate, right? The River Merchant's Wife, a letter, is a poem he claims to be translating. It's also a poem in the voice of a young Chinese girl who's married to a river merchant, and he takes on her voice. He pretends to be speaking in that voice. And, it is totally fair, contra Peter Orner, to yell at him, to say, hey, you're just some old racist white guy. What right do you have to speak in this girl's voice? It's just that at the same time, however flawed, however artificial, however clumsy that attempt, it also produces a beautiful love poem. And one that maybe can't really exist merely as imagined speech, but has to exist as imagined speech in the voice of someone who has no right imagining it. And that's, I find not just a quality I can love the grapes in spite of, but a quality I love the grapes in part because of. So with that, I'm going to read this poem just once through. I apologize for my shitty French pronunciation along the way, and I apologize also for Anthony Hecht's tastelessness. I still love this poem. And I hope at least maybe you will find something in it worth loving, even if you ultimately side with Zara and Jonathan, which is, again, pretty fucking reasonable to do. All right, here's The Grapes by Anthony Hecht. At 5 o'clock of a summer afternoon, we are already shadowed by the mountain on whose lower slopes we perch. All of us here at the Hotel de l'Univers at Déjeuner. The fruit trees and the stone lions out front, in deepening purple, silhouette themselves against the bright green fields across the valley, where, at the Beau Rivage, patrons are laved in generous tides of gold. Just real quick, she's describing how in the afternoon, the hotel where she works is cloaked in shadow. And the hotel across the way, the fancier hotel, the Beau Rivage, which is the beautiful view, I think that's what rivage means, view? The shoreline. Oh, I wonder if there's a little bit of a nod to the far shore, from Virgil, the shore where all of the souls are reaching out to go into the afterlife. Anyway, that's what she's talking about. She's watching that, that they're sort of, the metaphor is a little heavy here, where the sun is already passed on from the hotel where she works, and it's shining in golden waves on the hotel across the way. I'll start from the beginning, and I hope the rest of it's relatively clear. Chambermaid, fantasies, magazines downstairs, out of date, hot Marc Antoine, the bellhop, who probably is not really going to be into her because she's a little older than him, and he's not dreaming of chambermaids anyway. He's dreaming of sexy millionairesses in bikinis. And then the grapes, the bunch of grapes and the sun shining on them. All right, I'll start again. I'll try to make it through this time. The Grapes by Anthony Hecht. At 5 o'clock of a summer afternoon, we are already shadowed by the mountain on whose lower slopes we perch. All of us here at the Hotel de l'Univers at Déjeuner. The fruit trees and the stone lions out front, in deepening purple, silhouette themselves against the bright green fields across the valley where, at the Beau Rivage, patrons are laved in generous tides of gold. At cocktail time, their glasses glint like gems, while we're eclipsed. Which may explain why the younger set, which likes to get up late, assess its members over aperitifs, prefers that western slope, while we attract a somewhat older, quieter clientele. Americans mostly, though they seem to come from everywhere and are usually good tippers. Still, it is strange and sad, at cocktail time, to look across the valley from our shade, as if from premature death, at all that brilliance, across which silently on certain days shadows of clouds slide past in smooth parade, while even our daisies and white irises are filled with blues and darkened premonitions. Yet for our patrons who are on holiday, questions of time are largely set aside. They are indulgently amused to find all the news magazines on the wicker table in the lobby are outrageously outdated. But Madame likes to keep them on display. They add a touch of color and a note of home and habit for many. And it's surprising how thoroughly they are read on rainy days. And I myself have smuggled one or two up to my bedroom, there to browse upon arrested time in Time Incorporated. There, it is always 1954. And Marlon Brando, perfectly preserved, sullen and brutal and desirable, avoids my eyes with a scowl. The record mile always belongs to Roger Bannister. The rich and sleek of the international set are robbed of their furs and diamonds, get divorced, in a world so far removed from the rest of us, it almost seems arranged for our amusement, as they pose for pictures, perfectly made up, coiffured by Mr. Charles, languid, serene. They never show up here. Our little resort is far too mean for them, except in my daydreams. My dreams at night are reserved for Marc-Antoine. One of the bellboys at the Beau Rivage. In his striped vest with flat buttons of brass, he comes to me every night after my prayers. In fantasy, of course. In actual fact, he's taken no notice of me whatsoever. Quite understandable, for I must be easily 10 years older than he, and only a chambermaid. As with all the very young, to him the future's limitless and bright. Anything's possible. One has but to wait. No doubt it explains his native cheerfulness. No doubt he dreams of a young millionairess, beautiful, spoiled and ardent, at his feet. Perhaps it shall come to pass. Such things have happened. Even barmaids and pantry girls have been seen translated into starlets tanning themselves at the end of a diving board. But just this morning, something came over me, like the discovery of a deep secret of the universe. It was early. I was in the dining room, long before breakfast was served. I was alone. Mornings, of course, it's we who get the light. An especially tender light, hopeful and soft. I stood beside a table near a window, gazing down at a crystal bowl of grapes in ice water. They were green grapes, or rather, they were a sort of pure, unblemished jade, like turbulent ocean water, with misted skins, their own pale, smoky sweat, or tiny frost. I leaned over the table, letting the sun fall on my forearm, contemplating them. Reflections of the water dodged and swam in nervous, incandescent filaments over my blouse and up along the ceiling. And all those little bags of glassiness, those clustered planets, leaned their eastern cheeks into the sunlight, each one showing a soft meridian swelling where the thinning light mysteriously tapered into shadow, to cool recesses, to the tranquil blues that then were pillowing the Beau Rivage. And watching, I could almost see the light edge slowly over their simple surfaces, and feel the sunlight moving on my skin, like a warm glacier. And I seemed to know in my blood the meaning of sidereal time, and know my little life had somehow crested. There was nothing left for me now. Nothing but years. My destiny was cast, and Marc-Antoine would not be called to play a part in it. His passion, his dark queen, he'd meet elsewhere. And I knew at last, with a faint, visceral twitch, a flood of weakness that comes to the resigned, what it must have felt like in that rubber boat in mid-Pacific to be the sole survivor of a crash, idly dandled on that blank, untroubled waste, and see the light decline, taper and fade in graduated shades behind the international dateline. An accident I read about in Time. And that last Time is, of course, italicized and capitalized because it is the name of the magazine in which she reads about this. So again, that final moment, that epiphany, she watches the grapes, she watches the sun crawling over them, and she sees that her own life has come past its midpoint, past its high point. And in imagining Marc Antoine's own life and trying to put herself in his shoes, she sees that he's got his own nighttime fantasies that have nothing to do with her. And it hadn't occurred to me before reading through it this last time that the place Hecht ends the poem is with his chambermaid trying to imagine herself into an alien situation. Thinking about the loss of hope, the softening, the resignation that came with her recognition that her life had crested. She imagines that must be like what the shipwreck survivors felt on their rubber rafts in the middle of the ocean. I knew at last, with a faint visceral twitch, a flood of weakness that comes to the resigned, what it must have felt like. What it must have felt like in that rubber boat in mid-Pacific. To be the sole survivor of a crash idly dandled on that blank, untroubled waste, and see the light decline, taper and fade in graduated shades behind the international dateline. An accident I read about in Time. What it must have felt like. And of course, she is probably wrong. It probably didn't feel anything like being a chambermaid in a well-populated hotel in the Swiss Alps, watching the light shine through a bunch of grapes before a luxury breakfast is served to American travelers. It probably felt nothing like that, to be starving and dying of thirst alone on a rubber boat in the middle of the fucking Atlantic. Pacific! Fuck! Damn it! But it's the best she can do. And this poem may be the best Hecht can do. And maybe that's not good enough. But I'm still grateful for it. Just as I'm grateful for all of you. That is what I've got for you this week. I'm going to have, as I said, a bunch more Secret Show stuff coming up for you. I just need to edit it and get it out there. Apologies too for just the show notes are going to be fucked for this little stretch. Maybe once I'm done with the magnet stuff, I'll be able to get back on that in a more consistent way. But I've got some really great conversations scheduled for the next week or so. One of them I just scheduled in the middle of this recording. I'm so psyched about this. But you can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.